It had been 2 years of bloody fighting. The men of the Union Army of the Shenandoah, including the 1st Vermont Cavalry, were enjoying a well-earned day of rest. They had just beaten General Jubal Early and his Confederates for the 3rd time. It seemed victory might finally be theirs. Little did these men know that the events of the next day would create unexpected heroes whose strength and courage would change the course of the war.
Vermonters rapidly responded to the call for volunteers that Lincoln issued in the days immediately following the fall of Sumter. Ultimately, over 34,000 Vermonters, roughly 10% of the population, would serve in the Union Army. The overwhelming number of those were volunteers. They were doing it because they felt it was the right thing to do.
War meetings were held in all the towns, big enough to have a town hall. Bands played the local importance, gave speeches. The young ladies were on hand to kiss the boys who signed up. And they flocked to enlist to save the Union.
The Civil War generation, their grandparents had fought and won the American Revolution, and they had been raised on these stories of this selfless service. We weren't doing it for money. We weren't doing it for greed or for land. We were doing it for freedom. We were doing it because it was our duty.
But the cavalry doesn't form until the fall, when one Vermonter, a 50-year-old guy named Lemuel Platt, goes to Washington and says, "Can't we have a Vermont cavalry regiment?" And he wins permission from the War Department.
Cavalry was very popular in those days. People liked horses. There was a lot of romance with cavalry. And as a result, when the opportunity came to join the Vermont Cavalry, they were given 40 days to fill the quota, and it only took 42 days to get basically 1,100, 1,200 men to sign up.
These men who showed up were green. They were very unprepared for the military service that awaited them, which worked out rather well because many of the horses were unprepared for military service as well.
These were farm boys, and they knew how to drive a horse in the field. They knew how to hitch a horse up probably to a wagon and drive him, but they weren't experienced people on horseback.
The men mustered in Burlington at Camp Ethan Allen in the Chittenden County Fairgrounds.
The horses and the men came together at Burlington, and there they're supplied with horses, and apparently a goodly number of those horses came from Vermont farms.
By the time of the Civil War, it was widespread knowledge that the Morgan horse was the horse of choice if you could get them. They found that those Morgan horses were more easily sustainable, extremely loyal, very durable, very sensible, and very controllable.
The expectation from a cavalry horse was not that it would be a gigantic, intimidating creature. There was a tendency to believe that short and fast was the ideal type of horse. And certainly the Morgan horse fit that bill.
After some initial training, the Vermont Regiment and their Morgan mounts boarded trains for Washington. They still had a lot to learn.
And they camped briefly near Capitol Hill, and then they're ordered to Annapolis, Maryland, and that is where the famous ride takes place from Washington to Annapolis, and they're described as riding with just things tied on to the horses haphazardly. Mattresses, pots and pans, blankets, and things are falling off, and so they're having to get off and pick them up and tie them on. They don't know how to tie knots. They don't know how to organize a load, and so by the time they reach Annapolis, as a train of Vermont originated equipment, I suppose, strewn the 30 miles or whatever it is.
There's a difference between riding a horse and walking behind a horse plowing a field. And the training to convert basically a pedestrian civilian into a cavalryman was not easy. William Wells talked about, in one of his letters home, going down to the corral at night and watching the fun as these country boys tried to learn how to ride a horse.
It was drill, drill, and more drill, until they got to the point where they were able to fire from their horses and do saber charges and have the horses accustomed to all military noises, and there would be infantry and artillery camps nearby, so they could do joint maneuvers so that the horses would become accustomed to the artillery fire.
To actually train a horse to engage an enemy, to attack an enemy, to cross an open field at full speed took a great deal of work. The sound would increasingly become overwhelming. You'd hear it in your ears as you raced across this open field. You would draw your saber, race full gallop. You would find another cavalry force racing into you also at full speed, crashing into one another, with guns, pistols, and carbines going off, with sabers slashing into one another.
The Vermonters open in the Shenandoah Valley on the 16th of April, 1862, but they begin really to prove themselves when they're having these brushes with Mosby, with the gray ghost of the Confederacy, John Singleton Mosby.
Mosby was a very dynamic military commander who had as his purpose to attack Union supply depots, railroads, training sites, to harass the supply trains and to keep them in a state of upset.
And of course his great coup is to ride in the night into the 2nd Vermont Brigade headquarters at Fairfax Courthouse and kidnap Brigadier General Edwin Stoughton, the commander of the 2nd Vermont Brigade, and 30 soldiers and 50 horses. But soon thereafter, the Vermonters get some real revenge when Mosby's men attack a railroad train carrying Vermont soldiers and supplies with a howitzer and knock it off the tracks. And the Vermont cavalry comes right along and chases Mosby's men with that howitzer up into the hills, and they come back with a howitzer. The word of that victory spread pretty fast, and they're holding their own with Mosby very soon. So their reputation is building, but I think the reputation is really solidified at Gettysburg. July 3rd, 1863 at Gettysburg. The great event, perhaps in all the Civil War, happens that day, Pickett's Charge. Probably the most important attack of the Civil War. And it's Robert E. Lee's last great try at victory at Gettysburg, and it fails miserably after the battle has been decided. Way down on the southern end of the battlefield, a cavalry commander named Judson Kilpatrick, with the nickname of Kill Cavalry, decides that he's going to make a charge on the right flank of the long Confederate line.
He was a little miffed that he had not been able to do anything to promote Judson Kilpatrick, which was one of his favorite things to do. And he had the brilliant idea that because the Confederates would be demoralized after Pickett's charge, if he could get in behind Lee's lines, he could wreak havoc on the supply wagons and the medical facilities and just in general demoralize Lee's troops.
And he gives the assignment to Elon Farnsworth and his brigade. Farnsworth is a sensible young man, and he questions whether it can be successful. And he wins a delay in this thing so he and some other soldiers can go out front and look over the land they're going to be attacking into. And Farnsworth comes back and he said, you know, it's full of boulders and trees and there's Confederates out there and they're well prepared and I don't think this thing can succeed. And Kilpatrick says, well, if you won't lead the charge, I will. He insults Farnsworth's honor and Farnsworth says, very well.
Second in command to Farnsworth that day was Vermonter William Wells of Burlington. who had been promoted through the ranks to lead the 1st Vermont. Before the start of the battle, Wells was overheard to remark, "I'd rather charge into hell than in there."
The Vermonters ride out into the fields of the Slider farm, and it's like a great bowl. Up on the hill toward the Emmetsburg Road, to their left is Confederate artillery, there's Confederate infantry around, there's Confederate cavalry around, and the Vermonters become like fish in a bowl.
And it was simply like being at a fairgrounds with a BB gun shooting out the stars on the cards farther down in the little tent.
It's a shooting gallery, and the largest number of losses the Vermont cavalry suffered in any one day was at that particular battle.
They are hit from 3 sides, and it becomes a matter of getting out. Wells and Farnsworth finally decided the only way we can get out is to go off to the right, up over that hill, and up in there they meet Confederate infantry, and as Farnsworth vaults his horse over a stone wall, he is riddled with bullets, shot dead. Wells gets away.
In the face of unrelenting Confederate fire and the large loss of men and horses, Wells assumes command and rallies his troops. They urge on their Morgan mounts, who never waver and never panic.
The horses had all they could do to navigate that terrain, and I would bet that many of those horses did exactly what they had to do, or else they wouldn't have made it back. Jumped over those walls, jumped over those boulders, whatever appeared in front of them, and kept on going.
For his effort that day, Wells is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
If you talk about a purely courageous act, to get on your horse and ride out there knowing what was coming and going through with it, that says an awful lot for what these troops are made of.
You had to realize when you went over that first wall that life could be short. They had to have an elevated level of courage, an elevated level of dedication, and a will to survive. And not only did they have to have that, but their horse needed to have that too.
There's a statue on the Gettysburg battlefield of William Wells moving to mount up for the charge at Gettysburg, which I think is the great tribute in stone to the Vermont cavalry, because there is Wells eagerly heading for his horse to do a task that he knows is probably hopeless.
Well, certainly Gettysburg was a big victory for the North, but at great cost at the same time. 50,000 casualties in 3 days, and besides those human casualties, the toll on horses was great. Many thousands of horses were killed. So they really needed horses more than perhaps any other time during the war. Tens, hundreds of thousands of horses to serve. So Colonel Preston, particularly from the 1st Vermont, would have to go back up to Vermont and begin to gather up more horses, particularly Morgan horses, for ensuing operations. And his journey reflected a larger crisis that the Union was facing in terms of supplying mounts for the cavalry arm. They decided that they need depots to organize, refit, and distribute cavalry mounts to the Cavalry Corps, and the largest in the North would be Geesboro, which would be formed along the Potomac River.
The Union's resupply effort was part of a new strategy. The role of the cavalry was about to change.
After the Union victories at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg, there seemed to be this moment where the Union would move to inevitable victory. Things didn't turn out that way, and the war settled down into a long stalemate.
So a new approach was seen as needed, and it seemed that General Ulysses S. Grant could provide that new approach. When he became General-in-Chief in March of 1864, he brought a vision of using Northern resources to their fullest, to strike at the Confederacy wherever he could.
The Confederate will to resist had to be destroyed. And the way to do that was to deprive the South of the means of waging war, to attack the small industrial base of the South, to capture its remaining ports, but especially to damage or destroy the agricultural basis of the Southern economy.
Now, the cavalry arm could strike beyond the reach of these more slow-moving infantry forces, bring the war home to the Confederates, and inflict hard war, what we might call today total war, upon the enemy forces and the civilians at home to convince them that the war is over and you have been defeated. You need to realize that.
Hard war. It would mean extreme hardship for the men and misery for their horses. Cavalry raids deep behind enemy lines meant days, even weeks in the saddle, with little means of resupply.
For a cavalryman to leave base, to leave contact with the Union Army, they had to be well mounted. Keeping that horse sound was the #1 priority. That was their way in and their way back. They had about 3 days worth of grain strapped across the pommel of the saddle. They carried everything that they could need, but that could get on the horse. A horse, once that first 3 days of grain ran out, would probably drop about 75 pounds within 3 days. The saddles themselves were designed not to cut the horse's back as the horse shrunk in size, and the horse needed to stay saddled. If they were deep behind enemy lines, you needed to be able to get up and go quickly. You couldn't break down and camp at night. You had to stake that horse out on a 10-foot rope and sleep with the horse saddled and ready to go.
As the war progresses, the horses became thin, emaciated. They couldn't find enough food for them. They're fighting on land that's been fought over and grazed and grazed and grazed. Almost all the horses having running sores under the saddle that they couldn't heal. And the smell of that was awful.
Diseases and horse maladies were just so common. Potomac fever and strangles, which are passed horse to horse, and in the case of Potomac fever, mosquitoes would give the horse that disease. A founder was one of the most feared diseases in the Union Army.
There's a magnificent description of cavalry horses written by Charles Francis Adams, one of those Massachusetts Adams, you know, with all that presidential lineage. And he talks about the horrible plight of cavalry horses.
During the Civil War, you find him writing about his men and about his horses, especially in letters to his mother, about the anguish he feels. First, because the conditions of warfare are such that often his horses have to be essentially ridden to death. It's necessary for military operations to simply ride the horses beyond their means to recover. He describes as the armies travel, the roadsides are littered with dead and decaying horses.
The horses and the men bonded together so well. In the case of Frank Haskell, a very well-noted Civil War biographer of Gettysburg, often quoted, his horse had been shot in the evening, and he knew that he'd been shot. He thought nicked, and 3 hours later, the horse would not move as Haskell tried to spur him forward, and here the horse had been shot through the chest, and the bullet had come out his side, and yet he'd still stayed up to keep his rider up. That's the kind of commitment and dedication that the horses had. They were as focused on doing the job as the men were. They were together as one.
Robert E. Lee sends a Confederate army into the Shenandoah Valley commanded by Jubal Early, a hard swearing, hard drinking veteran commander. Old Jube has two orders. Protect the Shenandoah Valley because it's the prime source of food for Lee's army. It's the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And also try to raise enough hell so that you can draw some of Grant's troops off to try to deal with you in the Shenandoah. And Early does a magnificent job. He comes out of the Shenandoah and attacks Washington. And Grant has to send the whole 6th Corps, 12,000 men, up to Washington to save the capital.
Grant got a little upset at that situation and said, well, we're going to fix this. And he put Sheridan in charge of that operation to go into the Shenandoah Valley and take care of those Confederate forces which were causing that problem.
Problem is that Sheridan has never commanded an army this size, and he dawdles. One day Grant gets off the train at Charlestown, where Sheridan's headquarters there, and what Grant's doing is giving him a kick in the tail, and it worked. 2 days later, Sheridan strikes at Winchester, and a major victory toward bringing the Shenandoah Valley under control at Winchester.
As he rallies his forces after his victory at Winchester, Sheridan urges his commanders to eat out Virginia clear and clean, so that a crow flying over it will have to carry their own food with them. Sheridan's army pursues Early, burning everything in his path, and presses the attack.
Sheridan follows Early, and 3 days later at Fisher's Hill, he pulls off a magnificent surprise attack and knocks Early off Fisher's Hill, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and sends Early in retreat 50 miles down the valley.
Early was very resilient, so even though they thought it's like whack-a-mole, they thought they had him down and boom, he's back again, thought they had him down and boom, he's back again. Every time he was back with less men, but he didn't quit.
Robert E. Lee, the best general in the Civil War, quietly reinforces Early. Early follows close on Sheridan's heels.
As the men of the 1st Vermont Cavalry slept, it began. Jubal Early was back.
And within half an hour, Sheridan's army is in retreat, despite heroic stands made by the 8th Vermont, and it's a military disaster. Where's Sheridan? He's 12 miles to the north in Winchester. Spent the night in a very comfortable house in Winchester, still there. He wakens to the distant rumble of guns. What's this? Might be just a long-range exchange. But he hastens breakfast, gets his staff mounted up, starts south on the Valley Pike on Rienzi.
Rienzi was a full-blooded, purebred Morgan. He was solid black except for some small socks on his 2 front and 1 hind foot.
Rienzi was a magnificent horse. First of all, he was a very big horse. When he would, go out with Sheridan and be all animated, prancing, with his neck arched, and the nostrils descending and everything, it was just a beautiful, magnificent, showy horse. There was really a strong bond, between Sheridan and Rienzi. Their personalities were just naturally very well suited to each other, and the Morgan breed tends to be a very affectionate breed. They form strong attachments to their masters, and so he was very willing to do whatever Sheridan would ask him to do.
He rode the 16 miles from Winchester to Cedar Creek, going at flank speed. It only took him probably in the range of 20 to 22 minutes.
16 miles, most of it at a full gallop, a nearly impossible feat for a horse. It would make Rienzi and Sheridan living legends.
And he immediately meets stragglers fleeing the battle, and in the strongest language you can imagine, he rides to these stragglers, embarrasses them, orders them back to the battlefield, and soon he has a host of hundreds of these men following him, a white cloud of dust rising. It's a limestone road, you see, and everywhere Sheridan with that little black felt hat, waving at the troops he sees, telling them, "God damn you, get back into line, back to the battlefield."
When Sheridan arrived on the battlefield and rallied the troops, that was the end of the retreat. The troops came back, and so that at that point there was going to be no more further advance by the Confederate troops. So it was more or less kind of at a standstill at that point.
And then something remarkable happens. The Confederate soldiers begin to feel the ground tremble. They think it must be an earthquake. It's terrifying.
It sounded like thunder in the distance. It kept getting louder and louder and louder.
And then they discover the cause. Coming down from out of the northwest, 4,000 horses under Custer, including the Vermont cavalry, and Cedar Creek becomes an absolute rout. Sheridan had said before the battle, "We'll have all our camps before the night's over, boys," and they did.
They were actually capturing more men than they had numbers themselves. One man would be in charge of 45 guys that he captured. Another little trick they did at Cedar Creek too, every time they captured a cannon, they left one of their own men with that cannon because they didn't want anybody else getting credit for capturing.
And then as Jubal Early is moving south, down the Valley Pike, a bridge gives way. And William Wells and the Vermont cavalry come on this, and there is a treasure trove, battle flags, about 20 battle flags they capture.
The flags became very important later on in a political sense. Men who captured flags, Harry Woodbury was one, Fred Lyons of the 1st Vermont, Vermonters captured 4 flags. They all got medals of honor for that. They were all invited to Washington afterward, along with Custer, who was their absolute hero, to make a presentation to the War Department, Secretary of War Stanton. And of course, it came at a great time for Lincoln, with the election campaign being in a process and being able to show, not only tell people we won the battle, but here's the flags to show you, here are the heroes that did it. The end result of that battle was Early's army was basically shattered.
Wells, William Wells. Here's the commander of the Vermont Cavalry Regiment, William Wells, writing home to his mother. He's only in his 20s. It's the biggest thing of the war. It's probably the great moment in the Civil War for the Vermont Cavalry.
By the war's end, the strength and courage of cavalry horses had become legendary. Rienzi would achieve even more fame. At the Battle of Five Forks, Sheridan, angry at the course of the battle, grabbed a battle flag, and he and Rienzi vaulted into a swarm of Confederate troops, sending them into retreat. At the Battle of Quaker Road, General Chamberlain and his Morgan horse Charlemagne were both wounded. Charlemagne, bleeding badly, managed to bring the dazed Chamberlain safely back to lead his troops, and then collapsed. General Jackson's Morgan horse, Little Sorrel, remained so steadfast and unflinching during the fighting at the Battle of First Manassas that he helped earn Jackson the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Medal of Honor winner Edward Williston and his horse Pony fought at Gettysburg and Winchester. Pony was shot 7 times, yet he bravely endured the bullets lodged inside, continuing to serve Williston until the war was over. Many horses made it through to the end of the war, but over 1.5 million horses lost their lives. The 1st Vermont Cavalry left Burlington in 1861 with 1,200 horses. Only 200 survived.